Thank you very much. Before I ask you more about China, I'd like to unpack that a bit. I want to talk about the Cato Institute. Charles Koch, 1974, one of the biggest globalist oligarchs in the world, who invested so much to give to the elites and without accountability, formed an alliance at one stage with George Soros, I think. Mm-hmm. That didn't work, did it? But tell us just a little bit about the philosophy of the Cato Institute and where it comes from. It seems to be, on the one hand, a rampant free trader, on the other, and very right-wing. On the other, they've got some very interesting ideas about governance and how things should work.
Actually, Charles Koch and Soros are working together.
Is it?
Yeah, it's Koch. Both are working together. They co-founded a group called the Quincy Institute, which is essentially promoting a non-interventionist foreign policy. What people don't understand about Koch, I mean, he's known primarily for the largest privately held oil company in the U.S. But Koch is actually anti-intervention, anti-military intervention, pro-gay rights, pro-gay marriage, and pro-drug legalization.
All good stuff.
So all of those are issues where kind of got lost. So people presume that he was a crazy right-winger, when in fact, and this is kind of where he fits with Cato, is that we view ourselves as classical liberals. In American political context, we'd say libertarian. And there's a certain difference when you say liberal here, and I realize the Liberal National Party, exactly how that plays out in actual politics can be complicated. But for the U.S., liberals are leftists. While in Europe and elsewhere, liberals is something very different.
It's something very different.
That's
here
right.
In Australia.
That's why we typically say libertarian or classical liberal.
Sure.
Because trying to differentiate. But our view is that it fits together consistently. We believe in peace. We believe in social tolerance, but we believe free markets, broadly speaking, and limited government, a constitutional order are the best way to protect human freedom.
So you're ticking a lot of the more responsible international squares, in my view. Let's move on to China. Philip Davidson was here recently. He's the commander. Is that my mic?
I don't know if it's mine.
I think it's mine. It's the stubble on my chin rubbing against my microphone. And I did have a shave this morning. Philip Davidson is the commander of the Pacific Fleet, and it's now the Indo-Pacific Fleet, CINCPAC we used to call it, based in Hawaii. Philip Davidson was here recently and gave an apocalyptic account of China's evil intentions, and we Australians have to square up and stick with the strength of the United States, otherwise we're doomed. Mearsheimer said the same thing when he came here recently. Mark Esper said similar things at the last Munich Security Conference. And one of the more objective accounts of that conference had it that this moralistic attack on China is simply not being listened to anymore, especially in Europe, especially in Asia, where people, more sophisticated governments, have pragmatic views about China. They'll all do their own deal with China. They know that China could represent an existential threat. The Vietnamese have been through that in the past, and so have other countries. But it seems to me that we're being told this doomsday thing by people visiting Americans. You're not one of them. It's lovely to have a different perspective, Doug, but you can understand, can you not, how Australia is torn between its tremendous reliance economically on China as a global powerhouse, and which has underpinned Australian industry and prosperity over the last 2 or 3 decades, and that, of course, in China, on the one hand, are now rusted on religious belief that ANZUS provides us with a nuclear guarantee, which does nothing of the sort. All it does is consult. We have the obligation to consult each other if there is a threat to one or the other party, the United States or Australia. So how do you feel about this? And what's your view about the Chinese situation?
Well, I tend to be skeptical of apocalyptic thinking, especially where it benefits those who are stating the apocalypse. And obviously the U.S. Defense Department wants a larger budget, which is not to say they don't believe what they say, but it's certainly convenient where your arguments also give you a larger budget, a larger department, more influence, etc. And I think that's part of the problem. Look, if I was the U.S. naval commander, of course I'd want as many ships as I could get. I don't want just 11 carriers.
And not just, when I was at Harvard, it was 16 carrier groups. Now it's down to 11.
Yeah, why only 11? Why should,
But aren't they becoming white elephants? I mean, China has area denial through surface-to-sea missilery and through submarines and all sorts of technology. It would be very dangerous for the Seventh Fleet to go into Chinese waters, or they claim to be their waters.
I mean, I think these days the carriers are primarily useful against third world countries, non-powerful states, in terms of you sail up and you can bomb Iraq if you want to, or Syria or something else, as opposed to being a fight with a significant power that has area denial capability. I mean, again, this is where China doesn't have to spend nearly as much as the United States to prevent the United States from intervening. No American president would want to imagine an American carrier going to the bottom of the ocean, taking 6,000 sailors with it, and trying to explain to the American people how that happened. And while carriers are not easy to hit, even with missiles, still, it's a lot cheaper to use a lot of missiles and submarines to try to take out a carrier than it is to build a new carrier. And carrier groups, it's not just the carrier, it's everything else. These are very expensive modes. So you can understand why a naval commander might want all this stuff. I think that what we have to realize is that a malign China domestically doesn't necessarily mean a militarily aggressive one internationally. I think the challenge here is trying to discern Chinese, kind of ambitions. Historically, at least, they have not moved much beyond what they view as Chinese territory.
That's right.
Now, that's not always, comforting in the sense that they obviously view a lot of territorial things around. It turns out the Spratlys and the Paracels and kind of the Diayus, as they call them, the Senkakus, in their view, all of that is Chinese. On the other hand, there's very little evidence, I think, that they want to conquer other countries. That from their standpoint, getting control of Taiwan in many ways is kind of a historical return of something that was stolen from them during a period of humiliation.
Sure.
And that's not to Xi Jinping, I think, is a really bad dude. I mean, I have no affection for the current regime, so I don't think that one should underplay the malign nature of the current CCP and what it's doing domestically. But I think one wants to be very careful playing out doomsday scenarios, especially where I don't think they have that capability. The good news about deterrence is it also works against China. That is, other countries can build submarines and missiles that are capable of taking out Chinese carriers. The question here is, can you raise the price for China? And I think if this is an area to try to bring Europe in, and I don't think Europe wants to go to war with China, but an understanding, if the Chinese understand that any military aggression would be met by very serious economic consequences.
All right.
Those kinds of things.
Moving away from China then, one would have to say objectively that United States foreign policy under Donald Trump is in a hell of a mess. Afghanistan, there seems to be leading towards a long-lasting, or at least a peace that might or might not work, which achieves nothing. The Taliban will come in, human rights will be violated again, and it seems to me that there have been 16 years of war or more for absolutely no gain at all. In the Philippines, President Duterte says, we don't need this agreement with the United States. The status of forces agreement, which replaced the old system where the United States had dominance over Clark and Subic, that's no longer will exist. Vietnam is playing a very cool game, and yes, allowing American forces to come in and visit, something unheard of for those of us who went through the Vietnam War, but they're not going to do anything to jeopardize their freedom of action in the way they shape their own policies towards China. And that Vietnamese policy towards China is reflected in Indonesia and all the ASEAN countries where war is not the solution, military confrontation is not the answer, peace is, and peaceful negotiation is the way things have to be done. We are a signatory to the treaty to that effect in Southeast Asia. And, we should be, in my view, looking more at this. Now, my question to you is, if Bernie Sanders wins the election, and there's a possibility that he might, I'm not a betting man, but it's almost 50-50, could happen. Some of us optimistically hope that he will. What changes do you think he might bring about in terms of American awareness of its global obligations and where it has to pull back from. Does he have, in your view, or will he be surrounded by advisors who have sufficient sophistication about foreign policy to do something about it? Will he bring back perhaps State Department expertise that Donald Trump has been so busy in dismantling?
I don't have any doubt that he'll have some good advisors. He has a man named Matt Deuce who's advising him now, who at one point ran a foundation that was involved in bringing Americans over to the Middle East to see both Palestinians as well as Israelis, trying to promote a broader vision. And that's one area that Sanders, of course, has been criticized on. The Israeli ambassador was very angry with him because he said he'd move the U.S. embassy back to Tel Aviv from Jerusalem.
Sanders has said that?
Yes, Sanders.
He's Jewish, isn't he?
Yes, he is Jewish.
Liberal Jewish, yes.
That's right. I think that the challenge for Sanders on this issue is that he's primarily interested in economics, is that his passion, his fervor, his proposals, everything is focused on economics. So the question is, how much attention will he give to international issues? How much emphasis? How much? How many political chits will he spend in trying to push things? I think trying to discern where he stands is not easy. I think clearly he wants out of the Middle East. I think he recognizes that American policy for the last 2 decades has been nothing short of catastrophic. I mean, I don't know where it's worked. I mean, it's, destroy Iraq, destroy Libya, destroy Yemen. Wow, these are really great, accomplishments. I mean, it's a horrendous record. I think it's one that Sanders would clearly respond to. He's tried to take, at least rhetorically, a bit of a tougher approach talking about authoritarians, and I think in part to play against Trump's rhetoric of how much he liked al-Sisi and Mohammed bin Salman and Putin and others. Even Xi Jinping, who's a great friend and hugs and kisses him and whatnot. So some of that's political. It's hard to know exactly what his policy would be. He recently said that he would be prepared to defend Taiwan with other countries. Now, would he really go to war with China? I mean, the problem on this, and this is I warn Australians, is be very wary of relying upon promises thrown out by American policymakers. Of course, we will defend you. Oh yeah. Well, what happens? A China in 20 years that has a much bigger conventional military, a comparable nuclear force with the United States. Is the U.S. really willing to use nuclear weapons to protect allied countries in East Asia? And I'm much more skeptical. I think this is a point where the U.S. president says, wait a minute, I like you all, but frankly, I don't like you that much.
Would they defend? Would they defend the relationship? Would they defend Taiwan if it meant the loss of Los Angeles?
And that's where. My guess is that it's easy for people like Sanders to say yes, we would defend them, without thinking through the consequences. In part because Americans clearly believe, and Sanders may have that sense, that if America just says this, other countries will be deterred. And it's not so clear to me that's right. I think the moment the game of chicken starts being played, a country like China, which has much more intense interests at stake, may very well play that game too. And then the U.S. has to be very concerned. I think Sanders is more rational on this issue. 4 years ago, and I give Trump credit, he has not started the new war. I mean, Barack Obama destroyed Libya and has helped destroy Yemen. I mean, these are, and Yemen, my view, is an absolute atrocity that is promoted by the United States. He cannot get away with dump moral responsibility for that. It's an absolute atrocity. Trump he's kept on going, but he hasn't started anything new. 4 years ago in the Republican primary, at one of the debates, at least 3 of the candidates explained that they would impose a no-fly zone in Syria and that they would impose that on Russia, too. Chris Christie, who is then the governor of New Jersey, said, I would call him up and say, this applies to you, Mr. Putin. Don't test me. We don't have that weakling in the White House anymore. And my reaction to that is, okay, and then when the Russians, you shoot down a plane and the Russians shoot down an American plane, it's your move. Now what? Realizing that they're not going to let you get away. The whole notion that the U.S., and you can, this is the attitude that what we say goes. So I think this is an area where Sanders is definitely better. Where those policies come out, to what extent he moves back towards a more traditional, he'd certainly be more multilateral. I think that's where the State Department would come in, is that things he did, he'd want to do in context of other nations, and I think he'd be very respectful of the accumulated knowledge at the State Department the way that Trump is not. So that, I think, is a very clear, and that would be advantageous in kind of moderating some of these impulses that float around.
Sure. Thanks for that. Of course, this is theoretical because he may not win the Democratic nomination at all, and Trump looks like, if my bets were on it, I'd have to bet Trump getting a second term. So we're looking ahead at something we just don't know. Look, it's time for questions. I've had a good go now, and I'd like to invite questions from the floor. John, just wait for the mic. Say who you are. John Cleary.
John Cleary. Just continuing on that theme for the moment, what image do we have now of the Republican Party in the House, and what sort of ideological framework is there around the Republican Party? And if there is a second Donald Trump term, does the idea of Donald Trump chief CEO or the imperial presidency continue, or is there going to be some coherent ideological framework come back out of the Republican Party?
As long as he's president, I don't see any coherence. I mean, in the American political system, the president is dominant. Of course, I like parliamentary systems because, in theory, governments can govern. In the United States, the head of government does not necessarily control the legislature, so you often get very strange results. If he wins the presidency, I assume the Republicans will hold the Senate. Whether they take back the House is unclear. Some Democrats worry that a Bernie Sanders candidacy would enable the Republicans to take the House. That matters a lot because if we go back to where unified Republican control of Congress, there'd be a lot more flexibility and room for a Trump presidency. And my expectation at the moment is Trump has an advantage in terms of winning, but I always warn people, this is Donald Trump. I mean...
Unexpected.
Yes, we still have, about 9 months to go.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is a man who all you have to, I've lived through this. I can't believe I've lived through 3 years of this. I remember when he took office thinking, how can we go on? How can this, and it's every day. So a lot can happen. And it's dangerous to underestimate Sanders. I mean, even the Carter White House thought it'd be great if Reagan was nominated. They were convinced they would defeat Reagan. And along the way, in one of the primaries where you could vote for either side, Reagan got more votes than Carter in Wisconsin. And at that moment, a lot of the Democrats suddenly said, oh my God, maybe this guy could win. So be careful who we're telling some Republicans, be careful what you wish for.
It might happen.
Yeah, Bernie Sanders, if you're the nominee of one of the major American parties, you can win. So I still think it's unlikely, but I think it's certainly possible. So I think that Trump continues to dominate. Maybe as he gets toward the end of his term, Republicans are less willing to give him deference. The problem is he's made it his party, so there's no coherence at all. And on foreign policy, for the most part, the Republicans are incredibly warlike. I'm not sure exactly why. I mean, it's just everywhere. It's everybody. It's whatever Trump does that is not warlike, they get mad at. They don't like it. He's talking to the North Koreans. They want more sanctions than he wants to put on. I mean, so the GOP. Now, who runs for president after that? I mean, I think it's going to be a real mess. They're going to try to be populists. A lot of them don't have it kind of in their DNA. And my guess is if he wins this time, it's, we say blue for Democrats. It's a blue deluge the 4 years later. Demography, young people, there's so much there that I have trouble imagining that this can go on, that this can be the last hurrah. And then it'll be a radically different world.
Gentleman in the front, microphone.
Rif Ibaid, Emeritus Professor of Semitic Studies at Sydney University. Thank you very much indeed, Doug, for a very interesting talk. You have depicted very well to us the economic impact of the relations between America and China. Of course, we felt it here when there was a trade war. Our dollar, our stock exchange tumbled down or lifted up. You also depicted for us a picture of perhaps a gloomy one for the present year, what comes. I will not ask an apocalyptic question, but being an academic historian to a certain extent, I will ask about the past. Had Clinton Hillary Clinton won the election approximately 3.5 years ago. Would things have been different this year as far as the American-Chinese relations are concerned, and more close at home about the move of the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which had tremendous impacts in the Middle East? Thank you very much.
Well, Hillary Clinton probably would have had the U.S. in at least one more war in the Middle East. I mean, Hillary Clinton is extraordinarily hawkish. I mean, no one should
Against
have
Iran?
any...
Against Iran?
Iran would be the most obvious target. Look, you should have no illusions about Hillary Clinton. I mean, she's been very hawkish even back when she was First Lady. This is not somebody who's kind of a peacenik. I mean, she's the Democratic neoconservative. If you want to see a really creepy video, the video of when she's asked about the death of Muammar Gaddafi, because she was kind of the architect. She pushed very hard in the Obama administration. He was less enthused. She pushed very hard for the U.S. to get involved. And she's asked about Gaddafi's death, and she says, yeah, we came, we saw, he died. It's creepy. It is really creepy. So I would not, and on Israel, I think she would not have, on Israel, she is very pro-Israel, but within a normal framework where every president, while having the authority to move the embassy, never did, because they understood the impact. And I think she would be the same. That she would be, I mean, the U.S. has never been an honest broker there. I mean, no one should have any illusions about that. You know, it's a crazy pretense to think the U.S. has ever been even-handed there. But there's, for the most presidents have understood there's at least some limits. And I think she'd be part of that. That, I mean, if Trump wants to re-elect Netanyahu, I mean, you look at the peace plan. I mean, this is the most ludicrous thing. I mean, the Palestinians get Batustan state 4 or 5 years later if the Israelis and Americans want to give it to them after the Israelis have taken everything they want, and somebody somewhere might miraculously show up with money to give them. Oh yeah, well this is a plan that I would put a lot of faith in. I mean, this is to get Netanyahu elected. I mean, he has because he has an election coming up in a couple of weeks, the third one in a year. I mean, so the politics there, I think Trump is leaning very heavily in trying to help. And I think that's the best way to understand it. And she wouldn't have done that. I mean, she would have been quite willing to work with the Netanyahu government, but she would never have that kind of interference. On China, I think she wouldn't have launched a trade war. She would have had a more balanced sense of, there's a lot of stuff here and how do you deal with it. It's hard to know exactly where she'd go. But I mean, her husband was president at a time where we're talking about World Trade Organization and everything, where the vision of China, I think, was a more positive one. The hope was China comes into the WTO, you know, that economic growth will help liberalize it politically. This is a country that will move closer to the U.S. That has not worked out the way a lot of us hoped. But I still think that she would have been much more for engagement. She would have put pressure on. I mean, there are genuine commercial issues in terms of theft of commercial technologies and a lot of other stuff there. But I think she would have tried to come up with a more balanced sense of, you know, what do you do about Hong Kong? I mean, how do you deal with the territories? I think she would have tried to integrate it more. So at least in terms of China, it would have been a more balanced policy. It may not have been successful, but I think it probably would have been a more balanced one.
We have time for one more short question. Any takers? No takers. Yes, there's one here. This gentleman here. Wait for the mic. Say who you are.
Robert Middendorf.
Thank you.
What's the young generation in China like? Are they now likely to start to sort of stand up and look for the more democratic way of doing things as they are in Hong Kong? Is that building up at all? Do you see any of that?
Well, there are two cross currents. So I warn people, don't assume that a democratic China is not a challenging China. I mean, I've gone 7 out of the last 10 years for a summer program of teaching at a University of Economics. So I've dealt with students over time. And generally the students they don't like government controls, they like access to the internet, they don't like being told what to do. I mean, they like the idea of democracy in some sense. On the other hand, they're nationalists. I mean, they routinely tell me Taiwan is part of China. All of the territorial disputes, well, China owns all that. We know that kind of a thing. So don't assume, I mean, the Chinese students that I've dealt with do not want to become Americans or Australians or something else. They believe in China. So we shouldn't have illusions. On the other hand, I think that broadly speaking, they want a China that's more open, that's freer, that would be less threatening. But in that context, they also have a sense of a China that's been defeated over the years, a China that deserves more space and more influence. So I think it's a very complex sense. Now, we saw a real explosion on social media after the death of the doctor in Wuhan, Dr. Li, who had tried to warn people, and then he was paraded before the cops and pulled back, and then, of course, he ends up getting it, treating people, and dies. That created quite an explosion. So that shows, I think, that there's a sense out there of distrust towards the government, and they don't like a lot of the internet controls and stuff that's out there. So it's these are not passive, docile robots for the Chinese party. But don't assume that they are also ready to march for the West and Western values. I mean, I think that they want a China that's an independent China, probably more what we want, but certainly not what we would prefer.
Thank you very much. And that brings us to the end of the session, and I invite my esteemed nephew, Ahmed Polat, to come to the podium. I thought he was a cousin, but he insists he's a nephew. It puts me in my place chronologically. Oh, there's a gift, is there? I thought I'd followed the script pretty well here.
Yes.
A gift to who? Yes. Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen. I call on the esteemed religious leader Andrew West to come and present a gift to Doug Bandow on behalf of Affinity.
Thank you very much. Very nice.
Can I just say very briefly that it's really stimulating to hear Doug speak. I've been reading Doug's work in the American Conservative for quite a long time now. Interestingly, it's not really a conservative magazine, it's a very pluralist magazine. And one of the things that impresses me about Doug is that in this world of trolling and cheap commentary and all this sort of stuff, Doug is a genuine intellectual, a genuinely thoughtful person. I don't necessarily ascribe all of these positions to him, but he is in the tradition, the great American tradition of people like Jean Kirkpatrick and Russell Kirk and William F. Buckley, all great thinkers. So it is a great honour and pleasure to hear you speak. I think it also speaks, if I can just say, very well for my friend Tom, because he is bringing through the Centre for Independent Studies a lot of really stimulating speakers. So it's great that you are a great talent spotter for your radio program, but also for the CIS, and it's been wonderful that you've been able to share, Doug with Affinity, which itself is a wonderful bridge-building organisation. So thank you, Doug. Actually, you should be a winner. You should be a winner.
Uncle, great.